Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping into ancient slumber, drifting down a forgotten alleyway, somewhere between the faint crow of a rooster and the inside your villa. Servants are already bustling. Perhaps you hear the faint clatter of a coal scuttle, or the distant call of a street vendor hawking yesterday's stale buns. You're wrapped in the rough, scratchy wool of your nightshirt, but the feather mattress beneath you offers a deceptive softness, a fleeting promise of comfort before the day truly begins. Outside your window, the gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows, and the air smells of coal smoke and damp earth. You might even hear the rhythmic creak of a horse-drawn cart making its way down the cobbled lane. An early start to the city's endless churn. You're about to experience breakfast through the eyes of a Victorian child. And let me tell you, it's a breakfast you probably won't survive. Not with your modern sensibilities. No sugary cereals. No fresh fruit smoothies. Not even a decent cup of coffee for the adults. Just, well, you'll see. It's a world away from your bright, airy kitchen. A far cry from the perfectly portioned, brightly colored foods you might be used to. This is a journey back to a time when morning meals were about sustenance. Often meager, and sometimes, frankly, a bit grim. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps this little corner of the internet grow, and allows me to keep unearthing these delightfully obscure historical tidbits for your listening pleasure. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your location and local time. And let's see how far and wide our sleepy history community stretches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slowly peel back the heavy velvet curtains, the chill morning air seeping in, and you can just make out the silhouettes of rooftops against a sky that's more gray than pink. A new day, and with it, the pressing, often rumbling, question of breakfast. You trudge down the narrow, creaking stairs, the sounds of your bare feet muffled by threadbare runners. The air grows noticeably cooler as you descend towards the back of the house, where the kitchen, often little more than a scullery, awaits. This isn't the gleaming, spacious kitchen you might picture from Downton Abbey. No, this is the working heart of a modest Victorian home, a place of constant toil and minimal comfort. The very first thing that assaults your senses is the scent of coal smoke, thick and pervasive, clinging to the walls and seeping into every fabric. A small, sooty range dominates one wall, its iron belly still cold from the night, or perhaps just beginning to murmur with the first hesitant whispers of a newly stoked fire. The light in this space is dim, struggling to penetrate the grimy windowpane that looks out onto a tiny, enclosed yard. Any sunlight that dares to peek through is quickly swallowed by the oppressive gloom. There's a rough wooden table in the center, scarred by countless meals and endless scrubbing, littered with the remnants of last night's work. A forgotten knife, a half-empty mug, perhaps a few crumbs that a brave mouse might investigate later. Against the far wall, a rickety dresser holds a sparse collection of chipped earthenware plates and mismatched metal cutlery, polished only when absolutely necessary. There's no refrigeration, of course, just a cool larder or a stone slab to keep perishables from spoiling too quickly. A constant battle against the relentless march of time and bacteria. Your mother, perhaps, is already there, her back to you, hunched over the range, coaxing the reluctant coals to life. Her face, when she turns, is smudged with soot, and her hair, once perhaps a vibrant color, is now dulled by the ever-present dust she might be blowing on the embers. Or perhaps painstakingly arranging kindling. The kettle, a heavy iron beast, sits precariously on a trivet, waiting for the water to boil for the morning's weak tea. There's a palpable sense of resignation in the air, a quiet acceptance of the daily grind that begins long before the city truly awakens. You shiver, partly from the cold, partly from the sheer dreariness of it all. This isn't just a kitchen. It's a testament to endurance. A place where every meal is a victory against scarcity and the pervasive damp. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of coal fires in Victorian homes, while providing warmth, significantly contributed to the rampant respiratory illnesses of the era, especially among children who spent so much time in these smoky interiors. It's certainly a less than appetizing start to the day, isn't it? Imagine trying to enjoy your Cheerios with a constant haze of soot in the air and the smell of yesterday's damp laundry. You might think about complaining, but a glance at your mother's weary face reminds you that complaining isn't really an option here. The sheer effort required just to get the fire going, to boil a bit of water, feels monumental in this small, cheerless space. There's a subtle irony in the fact that while grand Victorian mansions were marvels of engineering for their time, countless families lived in conditions that were barely an improvement on centuries past, particularly when it came to the fundamentals of food preparation. It truly was a tale of two cities, and two very different breakfast experiences, often under the same sooty sky. Your stomach rumbles with an insistent, hollow ache that no amount of chilly air seems to soothe. Soon, however, a familiar, comforting smell begins to waft through the cramped kitchen. The earthy, slightly sweet aroma of boiling oats. Yes, you've guessed it, porridge. For countless Victorian children, particularly in working-class homes, porridge was not merely a breakfast option. It was the breakfast option. Day after day, week after week, often year after year, it was the same humble, gruel-like concoction that filled tiny bellies and offered a meager, yet vital, source of energy. You watch as your mother stirs the simmering pot over the now glowing embers. It's not the quick-cook oats you might know, but coarse, rolled oats, sometimes even oat groats, which required a significant amount of boiling to become palatable. The consistency could vary wildly. Sometimes it was a thick, stolid paste that could almost stand a spoon in it, other times a thinner, runnier gruel that barely clung to the spoon. The goal wasn't gourmet delight, but simple caloric intake. It was cheap, it was filling, and it could be stretched with copious amounts of water. The porridge itself was often unadorned. No fresh berries, no spoonfuls of honey, certainly no fancy cinnamon or maple syrup. If you were lucky, there might be a pinch of salt to give it some semblance of flavor. Or perhaps a meager dash of whatever milk was available. Sometimes, though, it was just plain, boiled oats, eaten quickly to ward off the morning chill and the gnawing hunger. You might pick up a small, chipped bowl, the earthenware rough against your fingertips, and receive your portion, steaming hot, a temporary comfort against the coldness of the room and the day ahead. There's a subtle art to eating it quickly before it cools into a congealed, unappealing mass. You learn to swallow without much chewing, coaxing the sticky substance down your throat. It's not exactly delicious, but it's warm, and it quietens the complaints of your stomach. For a moment, a fleeting sense of security settles over you. A small, warm kernel in the vast, unpredictable world outside. This simple bowl, for all its blandness, represented survival. A quirky tidbit. Some Victorian parents, particularly those who were slightly better off but still frugal, believed that adding a spoonful of treacle, a dark, thick syrup, similar to molasses, to the porridge would not only make it more palatable but also provide essential strength. Whether it truly added significant nutritional value is debatable, but it certainly added a much-needed sweetness to an otherwise dreary meal. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of such additions were based on genuine nutritional understanding, or merely on folk wisdom and a desire to make unpleasant food more appealing to finicky eaters. You finish your bowl, scraping the bottom clean, the last vestiges of warmth fading from your hands as you set the bowl down. It wasn't exciting, but it was done. And now, the rest of the day looms. With the last scrape of your spoon against the porridge bowl, a new aroma, perhaps slightly more enticing, begins to emerge from the kitchen. It's the subtle, savory scent of meat, not the glorious sizzle of bacon, mind you, or the rich perfume of roasting joints, but something far more humble, yet surprisingly cherished. Bread and dripping. This was another cornerstone of the working-class Victorian child's breakfast. A simple pairing that offered a much-needed boost of fat and flavor to an otherwise sparse diet. You watch as your mother carefully retrieves a large, often unevenly baked loaf of bread from a wooden bread bin. This isn't the fluffy, pre-sliced marvel you pick up from the supermarket. Oh no, this is heavy, dense bread, often made from coarser, less refined flour, designed to fill you up and stay with you. Each slice is thick, cut by hand, sometimes a little crumbly, sometimes a little tough, but always substantial. It's the kind of bread that feels like it's going to put hairs on your chest, even if you're only 8 years old. And then, the dripping. Ah, the dripping. For those unfamiliar with this Victorian delicacy, it's essentially the fat that has rendered off roasted meat, beef, lamb, or sometimes pork, collected and stored. It would solidify into a yellowish, waxy substance, often with a slightly greasy sheen and a faint, savory aroma. Think of it as a very primitive, unfancy, and utterly delicious form of spread. Your mother might take a knife and carefully scrape a dollop of this solidified fat from a ceramic jar or a tin, then spread it thinly, yet generously, over your slice of bread. Sometimes, if you were incredibly lucky, there might be tiny, crispy bits of meat still embedded within the dripping. Little nuggets of intensely savory flavor that were like finding gold in a mine. The texture is fascinating. The bread, slightly absorbent, soaks up a little of the fat, making it softer, richer. The dripping, when it hits the warmth of the bread, might soften slightly, releasing its subtle, meaty essence. You lift the slice to your nose, taking in the earthy bread, the savory fat. It's a primal scent, a promise of energy, and when you bite into it, it's surprisingly satisfying. The denseness of the bread, combined with the unctuousness of the dripping, provides a feeling of fullness that porridge alone sometimes struggled to deliver. It might seem odd to your modern palate, accustomed to sweet spreads and fruit jams in the morning, but for a child facing a day of hard labor or long hours in a drafty schoolroom, this was a genuine treat. It was fat, it was protein, and it was cheap. It was the epitome of making do. A quirky tidbit about dripping. It wasn't just a breakfast staple. In many working-class homes, dripping was also used in savory puddings, for frying vegetables, or as a base for hearty gravies. It was a testament to the Victorian era's incredible resourcefulness and their zero waste philosophy when it came to food. Every single calorie counted. Every scrap was utilized, and nothing went to waste if it could provide even a tiny bit of sustenance. You can almost hear your grandmother, or great-grandmother, gently chastising you for even thinking of throwing away perfectly good fat. Historians still argue whether the high-fat, low-sugar diet prevalent among the working classes, especially those consuming staples like dripping and hearty bread, inadvertently conferred certain health benefits. Despite the overall lack of sanitation and nutrition knowledge, was it just a crude necessity? Or did it accidentally stumble upon some dietary wisdom? The jury's still out, but one thing is certain. A slice of bread and dripping was a fundamental part of countless childhoods. providing a surprisingly satisfying start to days that were often anything but easy. You chew slowly, savoring the rich, simple flavor. Making it last. Each bite is a little victory. A small comfort against the sprawling, sometimes harsh, reality of Victorian life. It's a far cry from the vibrant, fortified cereals of today, but in its own way, it's a taste of history, a direct connection to the resilience of those who came before. As you finish the last morsel of bread and dripping, the steam from the kettle, which has been gently murmuring on the hob, finally reaches a rolling boil. And with that, comes the promise of the morning's beverage. Tea. Now, don't imagine a delicate cup of Earl Grey or a bracing Assam. For a Victorian child, especially in a working-class home, tea was a very different beast altogether. It was less about the nuanced flavors of exotic leaves and more about warmth, hydration, and, often, a generous dose of sugar. You watch as your mother pours the boiling water into a well-used teapot, often a sturdy, chipped ceramic vessel that has seen decades of service. Then, with a practiced hand, she spoons in a modest amount of black tea leaves. These weren't necessarily the finest grades. Often, they were cheaper blends, sometimes even sweepings from the factory floor, or what was known as dust tea. The leaves would steep for a few moments, creating a dark, strong brew, but for the children, this concentrated liquid was just the beginning. Before it reached your mug, the tea would be heavily diluted with more boiling water. We're talking perhaps 1 part tea to 3 or even 4 parts water, transforming it from a robust brew into a weak, often lukewarm, brown liquid. The purpose wasn't to stimulate, but to hydrate and to offer a sense of warmth in the often chilly homes. Then came the magic ingredient, especially for children: sugar. Lots of it. Large spoonfuls would be stirred in, masking the bitterness of the weak tea and providing a quick, if fleeting, burst of energy. Sometimes, if you were incredibly fortunate, a splash of milk might be added, though milk was often a precious commodity in these households, saved for more critical uses or for the youngest members of the family. You cup your hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into your chilled fingers. The taste is sweet, vaguely tea-like, but mostly just warm sweetness. It's a comforting ritual, a small moment of solace before the demands of the day begin. For many children, this sugary, watered-down tea was not just a drink. It was a psychological lift, a small luxury in a life often devoid of them. It helped wash down the porridge and the bread, and provided a sense of fullness that lasted just a little longer. It might even have been the first sweet thing you tasted all day. A mainstream historical fact here is that the burgeoning British Empire's expansion, particularly into India and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, led to a massive increase in tea production, making it affordable for even the working classes by the mid-19th century. What was once an expensive luxury became a staple, though perhaps not in its purest form for everyone. This widespread availability fundamentally altered British daily life, creating rituals and habits that persist even today. Imagine, for a moment, that almost overnight, a new, comforting beverage became accessible to nearly everyone, changing the rhythm of their mornings. Now for a quirky tidbit, to stretch the tea further and make it appear stronger, some unscrupulous vendors would actually add various adulterants to tea leaves, including spent tea leaves that had already been brewed, iron filings, or even sheep's dung. Thankfully, your tea is probably just heavily diluted, but the thought does make your heavily sweetened brew taste a little rustic. It gives new meaning to the phrase penny dreadful, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the perceived health benefits of tea, touted by some as a civilizing beverage, outweighed the potential harms of unregulated production and common adulteration practices. especially for children whose developing bodies were more vulnerable. You take another sip, the warmth spreading through your chest, the sugar coating your tongue. It's not just a drink. It's a tiny, liquid blanket on a cold morning. You finish the last drops, feeling a brief, fleeting moment of energy from the sugar before the true work of the day calls you away from the comforting confines of the kitchen. As the last of your sweet, watery tea vanishes, a lingering thought might cross your mind. Where was the milk? In your modern world, milk is a refrigerated given. A white liquid fortress of calcium readily available in cartons of all fat percentages. But in Victorian times, especially for a working-class family, milk was a far more precarious, and sometimes even perilous, commodity. Its presence on the breakfast table was less a certainty and more a stroke of good fortune. A fleeting luxury. You glance towards the larder. A small, dark cupboard built into a cool, north-facing wall, perhaps with a mesh screen to allow a minimal amount of air circulation while keeping out flies. Inside, you might see a shallow ceramic bowl, perhaps a jug, containing a small amount of liquid. This is your milk, and if it's there, it's likely been delivered early that morning by a milkman, perhaps with a horse-drawn cart, or simply carried in churns from a local dairy. There's no refrigeration as you know it, which means milk is incredibly susceptible to spoiling. On a warm day, it could turn sour within hours, transforming from a creamy white to a lumpy, unappetizing mess. This fragility meant that fresh milk was expensive and often rationed. For the youngest children, especially infants and toddlers, it was considered essential, a precious source of nutrition. But for older children, like yourself, its inclusion in your breakfast might be sporadic. Sometimes there would be a splash in your tea, as we just discussed, or a small dollop stirred into your porridge. Other times, there would be none at all, and your meals would be eaten black without the softening effect of dairy. The quality of the milk itself was also a constant concern. Without modern pasteurization, raw milk carried significant risks of bacterial contamination, including diseases like tuberculosis and typhoid. Imagine the anxiety for a Victorian mother, knowing that the very substance meant to nourish her children could, in fact, make them terribly ill. This lack of reliable, safe milk contributed to high rates of infant mortality and childhood illnesses throughout the era. It wasn't just about taste or availability. It was a matter of life and death. A mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of pasteurization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, championed by scientists like Louis Pasteur, revolutionized public health, dramatically reducing the spread of milk-borne diseases and making safe milk accessible to the masses. Before this, buying milk was a bit like playing Russian roulette with your gut flora. You never quite knew what invisible horrors might be lurking within that seemingly innocent white liquid. Now for a quirky tidbit. To combat the rapid spoilage and, regrettably, to increase their profits, some unscrupulous milk sellers would resort to adding water to their milk. This practice was so common that the term milkman's chalk was used to describe the white residue left in watered-down milk bottles, supposedly from added chalk or plaster of Paris to improve its color and opacity after dilution. It was a genuine scandal of the era, one that highlights the desperate measures taken by both sellers and consumers in a world without food safety regulations. Imagine trying to explain that to your modern-day milk delivery service. "Excuse me, but is there any plaster of Paris in this skimmed latte?" You'd get some very odd looks. Historians still argue whether the initial resistance to pasteurization, particularly from dairy farmers who feared the process would alter milk's flavor or reduce its natural goodness, significantly prolonged public health crises that could have been mitigated sooner. Was it genuine concern, or just economic self-interest? Regardless, the child you sips your tea, thankful for the sugar, and perhaps unconsciously grateful that you don't have to worry about what else might be floating in your morning brew. The absence of plentiful, safe milk at the breakfast table was a stark reminder of the era's limitations. A silent testament to the daily struggles faced by ordinary families. It makes you appreciate your perfectly chilled, pasteurized carton of whatever percentage milk you prefer, doesn't it? A simple luxury, once a deadly gamble. Having scraped your bowl clean and drained the last sweet drops of your diluted tea, your everyday breakfast experience might conclude there. But occasionally, perhaps on a Sunday, or a birthday, or a rare holiday, the scent emanating from the kitchen might be different, richer, undeniably more enticing. This is when the almost mythical, truly delightful treats like eggs or bacon might grace a working-class Victorian child's breakfast table. These weren't daily occurrences. Oh no, they were special occasion fare, signaling a break from the monotony, a fleeting moment of minor indulgence. You might wake to the tantalizing smell of sizzling fat, distinct from the subtle aroma of dripping. This is the sound of bacon, or perhaps just a sliver of ham, rendering its savory goodness in a hot pan. The sound alone would be enough to draw you downstairs with an almost desperate anticipation. Bacon, even a small rasher, was a luxury. It provided a concentrated burst of flavor and much-needed fat and protein that was a stark contrast to the blandness of porridge. Imagine the sheer excitement of seeing those crispy edges. The rich, salty scent filling the tiny kitchen. A truly alien concept compared to your usual fare. Or perhaps, you might hear the gentle crack of an eggshell, followed by the soft hiss of an egg hitting the pan. Eggs were another highly prized commodity. They weren't always cheap, and their freshness could be questionable. But a well-cooked egg offered a substantial and satisfying addition to the meal. Whether fried, boiled, or even scrambled, though perhaps less common for a quick working-class breakfast, an egg represented a significant upgrade. You might receive a single, perfectly formed fried egg, its yolk still a vibrant yellow, resting proudly beside a slice of that dense bread. The richness of the yolk, the firmness of the white, it was a sensory explosion compared to your regular fare. These rare additions weren't just about nutrition. They were about morale. They provided a brief, joyous reprieve from the relentless frugality. For a child, the sight of an egg or a piece of bacon on their plate was a clear signal that this day was different, special, perhaps even joyous. It was a tangible expression of a family's momentary good fortune or a mother's desire to provide a little extra comfort, even if it meant stretching the household budget to its absolute limit. You'd eat it slowly, savoring every bite, making sure not a single crumb or drop of precious fat went to waste. A mainstream historical fact is that while meat consumption increased throughout the Victorian era, particularly among the middle and upper classes, working-class diets remained heavily reliant on cheaper carbohydrates and vegetables. Meat, especially premium cuts like bacon, was still considered a luxury for many, making these occasional appearances at breakfast all the more significant. It wasn't until well into the 20th century that daily meat consumption became widespread across all social strata. So, when you see a full English breakfast today, remember that for most Victorians, that was the stuff of dreams. Or at least, a very rare Sunday treat. Now for a quirky tidbit about eggs. Given the lack of refrigeration, keeping eggs fresh was a constant challenge. Some Victorian households would attempt to preserve eggs by coating them in various substances like butter, varnish, or even a solution of lime or water glass. Sodium silicate. The idea was to seal the pores of the shell to prevent air and bacteria from entering, thus extending their shelf life for months. Imagine cracking open an egg and finding it coated in a waxy, perhaps slightly yellowed film. Talk about an unboxing experience. Historians still argue whether the occasional provision of these more protein-rich breakfasts, even in poverty-stricken households, had a discernible impact on the long-term health and growth of Victorian children, or if the overall nutritional deficiencies of their daily diet simply overshadowed these rare boosts. Did a single egg make a difference? Or was it just a fleeting comfort? You finish your precious piece of bacon, licking your fingers clean, the memory of its salty goodness lingering. The ordinary world will soon return, but for a few blissful moments, you tasted something truly special. As the last lingering taste of that rare, savory breakfast fades from your tongue, the harsh reality of the day begins to settle in. For some Victorian children, like you, perhaps, the next destination is school. For countless others, however, the path leads not to a classroom, but to a factory, a mine, a mill, or even the bustling, muddy streets themselves. And for these children, breakfast, if it existed at all, was a far more rushed, meager, and often incomplete affair, starkly highlighting the brutal inequalities of the era. If you are one of the fortunate few heading to a board school, or even a smaller, less formal dame school, your breakfast, though humble, at least prepared you for a morning of intellectual, however rudimentary, pursuits. You might have had your porridge, your bread and dripping, and your watered-down tea. Your mother would ensure you had at least something in your stomach. Knowing that sitting in a cold classroom, trying to absorb lessons, was an impossible task on an empty stomach. You might even be lucky enough to carry a small, wrapped piece of bread or a cold potato in your pocket, a piece for a mid-morning gnawing hunger. This was a relatively privileged existence, allowing for a semblance of a routine morning meal. But now, shift your perspective. Imagine you are not heading to school, but to the deafening clatter of a textile mill, or the dark, damp descent into a coal mine. Your day begins long before the sun even contemplates rising, roused by a stern parent or perhaps a shrill factory whistle piercing the pre-dawn silence. There's no leisurely spooning of porridge, no time for warm tea. Breakfast, for you, is likely a hurried, snatched affair. If it happens at all, it might be a piece of stale bread thrust into your hand as you stumble out the door, eaten on the run, or perhaps a cold, leftover potato from last night's meager supper. Sometimes, there was simply nothing. The raw hunger pangs would begin almost immediately, gnawing at your belly as you faced hours of demanding, often dangerous, labor. Children working in factories, as chimney sweeps, or as street vendors faced entirely different nutritional realities. Their bodies, still growing, were subjected to intense physical exertion without adequate fuel. Breakfast became a utilitarian transaction. Calories, however few, to keep you from collapsing. The concept of a balanced meal, or even a pleasant one, was alien. It was about survival. The very act of eating was subservient to the demands of labor. You might eat with grimy hands, in dimly lit, unhygienic conditions, the taste of dust or grime often accompanying your meager bites. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this grim reality is the widespread child labor. During the Victorian era, children as young as 5 or 6 were employed in arduous and dangerous industries, their tiny frames and nimble fingers exploited for profit. The Factory Acts, slowly introduced throughout the century, gradually placed restrictions on child labor and mandated schooling. But for decades, millions of children had their childhoods, and their breakfasts, consumed by demanding work. This was not a fringe issue. It was the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, powered by little hands and empty stomachs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very poor children, particularly those working in the streets, might resort to mudlarking along the Thames, scavenging for anything of value in the river mud at low tide. On incredibly rare, lucky occasions, they might find discarded food scraps, or even a piece of coal they could sell to buy a small piece of bread. Imagine that being your breakfast source, finding edible debris in the riverbed. It paints a picture of desperation that makes your humble porridge look like a feast. Historians still argue whether the long-term physical and cognitive development of these working children was permanently stunted by inadequate nutrition and the relentless demands of early labor, or if the sheer resilience of the human body allowed them to largely recover in adulthood. Did society pay an irreversible price for its industrial progress? You might feel a pang of sympathy for these unseen children as you consider your own relatively comfortable walk to school. The quiet clatter of your own breakfast dishes seems a world away from the deafening roar of the looms, or the oppressive silence of the mineshaft. Section 9. As the image of the hurried, meager breakfast of the working child fades, let us now transport ourselves to an entirely different realm of Victorian morning meals. The grand, often intimidating, upper-class dining room. This is a universe away from the smoky, cramped sculleries and the snatched bites on cobbled streets. Here, breakfast isn't merely sustenance. It's a social ritual, a demonstration of wealth, and a testament to the unseen army of servants laboring behind the scenes. You find yourself in a room bathed in the soft glow of a dozen gas lamps, perhaps supplemented by the faint, filtered light of a morning sun struggling to penetrate heavy velvet curtains. The air is warm, free from the pervasive chill and coal dust of the poorer districts, perhaps carrying the faint scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers. The furniture is heavy, dark, and exquisitely carved, gleaming with decades of careful maintenance. A grand, polished mahogany table dominates the center of the room, stretched out to accommodate guests who might have stayed overnight, or simply to emphasize the sheer scale of the household. But it is the table itself that truly commands your attention. It's not just set, it's an exhibition. Crisp white linen tablecloths, starched and pressed to perfection, cascade almost to the floor. Upon them, an array of gleaming silver cutlery lies arranged in precise, intimidating rows, each fork and spoon polished to a mirror shine, ready for its specific purpose. Delicate porcelain plates, perhaps adorned with intricate patterns or the family crest, are meticulously placed before each high-backed chair. Crystal glasses sparkle under the gaslight, waiting to be filled with fresh milk, fruit juice, a true luxury, or perhaps even a glass of hock. And then, the food. Oh, the food. It's not just one dish. It's an entire spread, a bewildering cornucopia designed to cater to every possible whim and appetite. You might see a vast silver chafing dish, kept warm by a spirit lamp beneath, holding perfectly scrambled eggs, light and fluffy. Beside it, a platter laden with crisp, streaky bacon, perhaps even rashers of ham or slices of cold roasted beef from last night's dinner. There might be a basket overflowing with an assortment of breads, light white loaves, hearty brown bread, perhaps even delicate brioche toasts, kept warm under a silver dome. Await a generous slathering of butter and preserves, strawberry jam, marmalade, plum jelly. Beyond the main dishes, you might find bowls of fresh fruit, glistening with dewdrops, oranges, grapes, apples, pears, all perfectly ripe and often imported at great expense during off-seasons. Small dishes of potted meats, savory spreads, and even smoked fish might be present, offering further variety. For those with a sweeter tooth, perhaps a plate of delicate pastries, scones, or even a rich fruitcake might be available. The sheer abundance is staggering, a direct contrast to the single bowl of porridge you just experienced. This breakfast isn't just about feeding hunger. It's about making a statement. It declares to anyone present, we are wealthy, we are established, and we can afford to eat like this every single day. A mainstream historical fact. The British aristocracy and wealthy industrialists in the Victorian era developed elaborate social rituals around meals, with breakfast evolving from a simple, personal affair into a more formal gathering. This shift reflected not only increasing prosperity but also the growing importance of maintaining social status and entertaining guests within the home. It became a display of their elevated position in society. Much like a peacock displaying its magnificent tail. You'd probably need a map just to navigate the cutlery, let alone decide what to eat first. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian upper-class dining rooms actually had small, hidden bells or speaking tubes built into the walls or under the table, allowing the host or hostess to summon servants discreetly without needing to raise their voice or make a show of it. Imagine trying to explain to your family why you keep pressing a button under the dinner table. Oh, just ordering another round of invisible toast. Darling. It adds a layer of almost comical formality to what should be a relaxing morning meal. Historians still argue whether the conspicuous consumption of the upper classes, particularly evident in their lavish breakfast spreads, served primarily as a necessary economic stimulus for the burgeoning food industry or as a stark moral failing that highlighted the immense social inequalities of the era. Was it a driver of progress? Or a symbol of excess? As you gaze upon this veritable feast, knowing what lies beyond the grand doors, you can't help but feel the immense chasm that separated one Victorian child's breakfast from another. It's a silent, delicious, yet undeniably unsettling tableau of an unequal world. You pick up a delicate silver fork, feeling its cool weight, and wonder where to even begin. As you sit at that grand table, surrounded by an abundance of food and gleaming silver, it's easy to forget the unseen army that brought this opulent breakfast to fruition. The silence of the dining room is a testament not to a lack of activity, but to the meticulous organization and relentless labor happening just beyond the swinging doors. In the cook's domain, this is where the magic, or rather, the sheer hard work, truly happens. You push open one of those discreet service doors, perhaps with a soft creak, and the transformation is immediate and jarring. The warm, polished serenity of the dining room gives way to a hot, bustling, and often chaotic world. The air here is thick with the mingled aromas of frying bacon, simmering coffee, melting butter, and perhaps the faint, sharp tang of something being pickled or prepared for later in the day. It's a symphony of culinary sounds. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzling of pans, the clatter of pots and crockery, and the low murmur of instructions and hushed conversations. The kitchen in an upper-class Victorian home is a vast, often cavernous space, far larger than any working-class kitchen, yet just as devoid of modern conveniences. A massive range, usually fueled by coal, dominates the room, its multiple ovens and hot plates radiating intense heat, making the atmosphere stifling, even on a cool morning. Pans of various sizes, kettles, and heavy iron pots sit waiting, or are actively in use, bubbling and steaming. Copper pots and pans, polished to a brilliant gleam by scullery maids, hang from hooks on the walls, reflecting the limited light. At the center of this hive of activity is the cook, or more precisely, the chef if the household was truly grand. This is a formidable figure, often a woman of immense experience and even temper, overseeing her domain with an eagle eye. She's not just cooking, she's orchestrating a culinary ballet. Around her, a flurry of other servants move with practiced efficiency. Scullery maids washing mountains of dishes, kitchen maids peeling vegetables and preparing ingredients, Perhaps a pantry maid fetching fresh supplies from the vast larders and storerooms. Each movement is precise. Each task is assigned, creating a complex machinery designed to deliver perfect meals on time, every single day. You might see a kitchen maid tirelessly whisking eggs for the perfectly fluffy scrambled eggs you just saw on the dining room table, her arm aching with the repetitive motion. Another might be carefully arranging fruit on a silver platter, ensuring every grape cluster is pristine. Yet another is toasting dozens of slices of bread over an open flame, constantly turning them to achieve that ideal golden brown hue. The sheer volume of food being prepared, the variety of dishes, and the tight deadlines before the family wakes or guests arrive demand incredible coordination and relentless effort. There are no microwave ovens here, no blenders, no food processors. Everything is done by hand, with muscle and skill. A mainstream historical fact is that domestic service was the largest category of employment for women in Victorian Britain, with millions working in various household roles, from scullery maids to highly skilled cooks. Their labor was the invisible engine that powered the elegant lifestyles of the wealthy. And the kitchen was often the most demanding and physically taxing department of the house. Imagine trying to prepare a multi-course meal for 20 people using only coal-fired ovens and hand tools, starting at 4 or 5 in the morning. It puts your modern brunch prep into perspective, doesn't it? Now for a quirky tidbit. To ensure the cook could monitor the progress of her many dishes without constantly opening oven doors and losing heat, some Victorian kitchen ranges had small, ingenious built-in thermometers, or even little peepholes, allowing a quick glance at the internal temperature or the state of a roasting joint. It was high-tech for its time, a small innovation to ease the immense pressure of getting everything just right. You can almost hear the cook muttering under her breath about a particularly stubborn batch of rolls. Historians still argue whether the hierarchical and often demanding nature of domestic service, particularly in the kitchen, fostered a strong sense of professional pride and skill among the staff, or whether it primarily perpetuated a system of exploitation and suppressed social mobility. Was it a pathway to expertise, or a dead end of drudgery? As you observe the intense energy of the kitchen, the stark contrast between this unseen labor and the serene consumption in the dining room becomes overwhelmingly apparent. The gleaming silver on the table is merely the tip of an iceberg, the visible manifestation of countless hours of invisible toil, ensuring that every Victorian child, if they were lucky enough to be born into wealth, had a breakfast fit for a king, thanks to the tireless hands behind the scenes. Stepping back into the hushed elegance of the dining room, away from the fervent energy of the kitchen, you notice the array of beverages on offer for the affluent Victorian child, a world apart from the watered-down tea you encountered earlier. For the gentry, breakfast wasn't merely about filling the stomach, but about gentle nourishment and refined indulgence. And this extended to their morning drinks. Here, you would find not just tea, but perhaps rich cocoa, fresh, unadulterated milk, and even genuine coffee for the adults, signaling a clear departure from the austere hydration of the working classes. You might be presented with a delicate porcelain cup, far more exquisite than the sturdy earthenware mug you previously held. Into this, a butler or a footman, moving with practiced grace, might pour a steaming, fragrant liquid from an ornate silver pot. This could be cocoa, a truly luxurious beverage in Victorian times. Imagine the rich, dark aroma, the velvety texture, the comforting warmth that spreads through you with each sip. Unlike the often thin and bitter chocolate drinks of later eras, Victorian cocoa, especially for the wealthy, was often made with high-quality, pure cocoa powder, blended with rich milk and sweetened to perfection. It was a caloric treat, a comforting indulgence, and a far cry from the utilitarian sugar water of poorer households. The milk, too, would be different. This wasn't the diluted, potentially tainted milk you encountered earlier. For the affluent child, milk was fresh, unskimmed, and often delivered directly from the family's own dairy, or from a reputable, clean farm. It would be chilled in the icehouse, a luxury in itself, and served in gleaming crystal pitchers. The peace of mind that came with knowing your milk was clean and safe was a privilege in itself. A stark contrast to the daily gamble faced by less fortunate families. You could pour a generous amount into your cocoa, or drink it straight, savoring its creamy richness, completely oblivious to the public health anxieties surrounding milk consumption that plagued the lower rungs of society. Beyond cocoa and milk, you might even see a gentle, lightly sweetened version of coffee being prepared for older children or special guests. While coffee was generally an adult beverage, its presence at an upper-class breakfast signified access to imported goods and a more cosmopolitan palate. These drinks weren't just about satisfying thirst. They were an extension of the overall breakfast experience, designed to provide comfort, warmth, and a subtle sense of superiority. The lack of concern over adulteration, the guaranteed freshness, and the sheer quality of the ingredients were silent indicators of wealth and privilege. A mainstream historical fact is that the rising popularity of cocoa and chocolate as beverages in Britain was driven by colonial expansion and increased trade with regions like the West Indies and South America. What started as an exclusive, expensive import for medicinal use slowly became a decadent treat for the wealthy, signifying sophistication and access to global markets. Imagine waking up and having a piping hot chocolate that tastes like pure luxury. It's quite a different start to the day than a gruel of oats. Now for a quirky tidbit. To ensure the perfect temperature for their cocoa or tea, some grand Victorian homes utilized elaborate tea urns, or coffee percolators, that were heated by a spirit lamp underneath, keeping the beverage constantly warm at the table. These weren't just functional, they were often beautifully designed silver or brass pieces, adding to the visual splendor of the breakfast spread. It's the original keep warm function, but with much more style and a dedicated butler to operate it. One could almost feel sorry for the servants who had to polish these magnificent contraptions daily. Historians still argue whether the nutritional benefits gained by affluent Victorian children through access to richer diets, including beverages like fresh milk and cocoa, genuinely translated into superior long-term health outcomes compared to their poorer counterparts. Given the pervasive health issues of the era, did better food truly make them healthier? Or did other factors, like sanitation and medical access, play a larger role? You take a sip of your rich cocoa, feeling the warmth spread through you, a sensation of genuine comfort and well-being. It's a quiet, sweet contrast to the harsh realities of other children's lives. A gentle reminder that even a morning drink could be a symbol of immense social divide. Beyond the steaming pots of cocoa and the pitchers of creamy milk, your gaze might drift towards another subtle indicator of wealth and the changing seasons on the grand breakfast table. Fruit. In your 21st century existence, a trip to the supermarket offers an endless, unchanging bounty of exotic and familiar fruits, regardless of the time of year. But for a Victorian child, even an affluent one, fruit was a much more limited, and often highly seasonal, treat. You might see a bowl, perhaps of gleaming silver or delicate cut glass, holding a carefully arranged selection. In summer, it might be plump, ripe strawberries or raspberries, picked fresh from the estate's kitchen garden or brought in from a local market. Their vibrant red hues would offer a startling splash of color against the white linen. And their sweet, Natural perfume would gently mingle with the other breakfast aromas. Or perhaps, in late summer or early autumn, you'd find a cluster of dark, juicy grapes, or a few perfectly ripened plums, their skins dusted with a fine, natural bloom. These were true delights, enjoyed for their sweetness, their refreshing juiciness, and their fleeting availability. As the seasons shifted, so too would the fruit on offer. In winter, the options dwindled dramatically. You might find apples or pears, perhaps those that had been carefully stored in cool, dark cellars since the harvest, their skins often a little bruised or wrinkled, but still sweet and crisp inside. Oranges and lemons, imported from warmer climates like Spain or the Mediterranean, would also make an appearance. But they were expensive and considered a luxury. Imagine peeling an orange in the dead of winter. Its bright zest and sharp, sweet juice a rare taste of sunshine. They weren't just a snack. They were a little burst of exotic warmth in a cold world. For the working-class child, however, even these seasonal, readily available fruits were often out of reach. A windfall apple from an orchard or a handful of wild berries picked from the hedgerows might be their only encounter with fresh fruit. And even those were often eaten raw, on the spot, far from any breakfast table. The idea of a bowl of cultivated grapes or imported oranges would be utterly unimaginable. A fantasy of the wealthy. The lack of varied fresh produce contributed significantly to nutritional deficiencies among poorer children, particularly the absence of vital vitamins that fresh fruit provided. A mainstream historical fact is that before the advent of globalized trade, refrigerated shipping, and advanced agricultural techniques, diets were overwhelmingly seasonal and local. For most Victorians, the concept of eating strawberries in December or bananas regularly year-round was simply impossible. This seasonal dependency shaped not just their diets but also their culinary traditions and preservation methods, like jams and chutneys, designed to capture the fleeting abundance of summer. You really had to wait for the bounty of nature. No instant gratification there. Now for a quirky tidbit about these seasonal fruits. Some wealthy Victorian households would have dedicated fruit courses during their elaborate dinners, sometimes featuring exotic fruits grown in their own hothouses, such as pineapples. Growing a pineapple in England in the 19th century was an incredibly expensive and labor-intensive endeavor, requiring specialized heated greenhouses and constant care. These homegrown pineapples became ultimate status symbols, sometimes only gracing the table a few times a year. Imagine explaining to your child that this single fruit cost more than a servant's annual wage. Talk about an expensive breakfast accessory. Historians still argue whether the dietary shift from highly seasonal, local produce to more varied, imported foods, as enabled by expanding empire and technology, ultimately improved overall public health or if it simply replaced one set of nutritional challenges with another, albeit more modern ones. Did access to oranges in winter truly offset the loss of nutrient-dense local greens? As you gaze at the vibrant fruit on the table, its freshness and rarity in this era are almost palpable. It's a quiet reminder that even the simplest pleasure of a ripe berry was a mark of privilege. A sweet counterpoint to the blandness that often defined a Victorian child's morning. As you nibble on a pristine grape, or perhaps finish a bite of truly fresh bread, a less savory, more disturbing reality of Victorian food supply looms. We've touched upon it briefly with the watered-down milk and the dubious additions to tea. But the truth is, food adulteration was a pervasive and often dangerous problem that affected nearly every breakfast staple. From your humble porridge oats to your precious milk, it's a dark stain on the otherwise romanticized image of Victorian culinary life. A widespread fraud that often put health, especially children's health, at severe risk. Imagine your daily bowl of porridge. You might think it's just oats. But what if it contained ground-up plaster of Paris to increase its weight and whiteness? Or perhaps chalk, mixed in to make it look purer? These weren't isolated incidents. They were common practices. Bakers might add alum to their flour, not to improve its texture, but to make even the cheapest, lowest quality flour appear whiter and therefore more appealing, mimicking the expensive white bread of the gentry. This was a direct deception aimed at fooling the eye and stretching ingredients. The sugar you so eagerly stirred into your tea wasn't always pure either. It could be bulked up with sand or even powdered brick dust. Your tea itself, beyond being watered down, might contain dried, spent tea leaves from previous brews, or even highly toxic substances like copper carbonate to enhance its green color, or lead chromate to make it look darker and richer. Think about that for a moment. Literally poisonous breakfast. It's enough to make your stomach churn, isn't it? Milk, as we discussed, was a prime target. Beyond watering it down, unscrupulous dairymen sometimes added chalk or even sheep's brains to thicken the diluted product, creating a false impression of richness. And perhaps most chillingly, formaldehyde was sometimes added as a preservative, a chemical that would be considered utterly terrifying in food today. Even the rare special occasion bacon or ham could be improved by adding borax or other chemicals to prolong its shelf life and mask incipient spoilage. It was a chemical cocktail masquerading as breakfast. The motivation behind this widespread fraud was simple: profit. With burgeoning urban populations and a highly competitive, unregulated market, vendors sought every possible way to cut costs and maximize their earnings, often at the direct expense of public health. Consumers, particularly the poor, were often powerless, lacking the scientific knowledge to detect adulteration and the financial means to demand higher quality, unadulterated goods. It truly was a buyer beware market, but the buyer was often desperately hungry. A mainstream historical fact is that the problem of food adulteration became so rampant and dangerous that it eventually led to public outcry and the passage of various Food and Drugs Acts. Starting in the mid-19th century, these laws, though initially weak, gradually introduced regulations, inspections, and penalties for food fraud, laying the groundwork for modern food safety standards. It was a long, hard fight to ensure that what you bought was actually what you thought you were buying. Imagine a time when you couldn't trust any food item, not even the simplest bread or milk. Now for a quirky tidbit: some Victorian coffee was found to contain everything from roasted acorns and beans to ground up chicory and even roasted horse liver. Yes, horse liver. The idea was to mimic the color and bitterness of coffee, stretching the expensive real coffee bean further. It gives a whole new meaning to mystery meat in your morning brew, doesn't it? Suddenly, your lukewarm tea doesn't seem so bad after all. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of chemical adulterants, particularly heavy metals and industrial byproducts, had a more significant long-term impact on the health and development of Victorian children than the general nutritional deficiencies of their diets. Was the immediate danger of poisoning greater than the slow grind of malnutrition? You consider the food on your plate now, whether it's the simplest piece of toast or a bowl of cereal, and feel a profound, silent gratitude for the strict food safety regulations that protect you. The ghost of adulterated porridge lingers, a chilling reminder that even the most basic meal was once fraught with hidden dangers, making breakfast a literal gamble. Having journeyed through the meager and the magnificent, the dangerous and the delightful aspects of Victorian breakfast, a clear, unmistakable truth emerges. A child's morning meal was not merely about sustenance. It was a powerful, often brutal, social indicator a stark daily reminder of their place in the rigid hierarchy of Victorian society. From the moment they awoke, the contents of their breakfast plate, or lack thereof, screamed volumes about their family's wealth, status, and prospects. Consider, once more, the working-class child, perhaps you, beginning your day with a bowl of thin porridge and a piece of bread and dripping, washed down with watery, sugary tea. This simple meal, while offering basic calories, reflected a life of constant struggle. It signified a household where every penny counted, where food was fuel, not pleasure. It spoke of parents who labored long hours, often in dangerous conditions, just to put meager provisions on the table. The very blandness of the meal underscored the lack of luxury, the absence of choice, and the pervasive hand of poverty that shaped every aspect of their existence. Your early start to school, or even earlier start to a factory, was dictated by the need to contribute, and your breakfast reflected that immediate, utilitarian demand for energy. Now, juxtapose that with the upper-class child, calmly selecting from a vast array of choices on a linen-draped table. The gleaming silver, the porcelain plates, the fresh fruit, the rich cocoa, the crisp bacon, each item was a tangible symbol of inherited wealth, social position, and access to resources. This breakfast wasn't just eaten, it was presented. It spoke of servants laboring in the background, of financial security that allowed for imported delicacies and seasonal luxuries out of reach for most. It signified a future likely paved with education, leisure, and continued privilege. The ritual, the formality, the very time taken to enjoy such a meal, were all powerful declarations of status. Even within these broad categories, subtle nuances existed. A respectable clerk's child might have slightly thicker porridge and unwatered tea, but still no bacon every day. A slightly less affluent gentry family might have fewer silver dishes, or less exotic fruit. Every element of the breakfast, down to the type of bread or the presence of butter versus dripping, was a subtle coded message, understood by all. It was a daily performance of social standing, enacted around the breakfast table. This stark difference in morning meals perpetuated cycles of inequality. Children from wealthier homes, benefiting from better nutrition, had a greater chance at physical development, academic success, and overall well-being. Their bodies were better fueled, their minds clearer. Meanwhile, children from poorer backgrounds often faced chronic malnutrition from infancy, impacting their physical growth, cognitive function, and susceptibility to illness. This foundational disadvantage, starting literally with their first meal of the day, set them on a trajectory that was incredibly difficult to escape. Your breakfast wasn't just food, it was destiny. A mainstream historical fact reinforcing this is that Victorian society was characterized by deeply entrenched class divisions, with vast disparities in wealth, health, and opportunity. Food consumption, particularly at mealtimes like breakfast, became a powerful and visible marker of where one stood on the social ladder. A daily performance of economic status. It was a society obsessed with appearances, and few things spoke louder than a well-laid table. You could tell a person's life story almost purely by observing their morning meal. Now for a quirky tidbit. Among the very wealthy, there was sometimes a peculiar practice of having two breakfasts. The first, a light, private meal taken in one's room, followed by a more formal, public breakfast in the dining room with guests. This wasn't due to extreme hunger, but rather a desire to maintain a certain image of leisurely sophistication, ensuring one was perfectly composed for the more social aspect of the meal. Imagine having to do breakfast twice. It sounds exhausting. One wonders if they ever got truly hungry for the second round. Historians still argue whether the stark visual and nutritional differences in breakfast across social classes were primarily a consequence of economic forces or whether they actively served to reinforce and maintain the rigid social structures of Victorian Britain. Did the rich eat lavishly because they could? Or did they eat lavishly to prove they could and thus keep the poor in their place? As you reflect on the silent but profound statements made by each morning meal, you realize that breakfast was never just about food. It was a daily census of the soul, a profound declaration of where you belonged in the vast, complex tapestry of Victorian life, setting the stage for the hours, days, and even years that lay ahead. As the echoes of clattering cutlery and the distant hum of the Victorian city begin to fade, you are left to ponder the lingering tastes of yesterday, and the surprising ways these historical breakfast habits have subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, shaped our modern diets and even our contemporary understanding of childhood. The Victorian morning meal, in all its stark variations, wasn't just a fleeting moment in history. It cast a long shadow. Consider, for instance, the ubiquitous nature of porridge. While no longer the absolute staple it once was, oats remain a cornerstone of healthy breakfasts worldwide. Your instant oatmeal, fortified with vitamins and available in a myriad of flavors, is a direct descendant of that bland, gruel-like sustenance that fueled countless Victorian children. The idea of a warm, comforting bowl of oats to start the day, particularly on a cold morning, is a concept deeply embedded in our collective culinary consciousness, a ghost of Victorian frugality and practicality. Even the humble tea, once a luxury, then a watered-down necessity, remains a cherished part of morning routines across the globe. The British obsession with a cuppa at any time of day, but especially in the morning, is a direct legacy of its widespread adoption during the Victorian era. And while we now enjoy it in countless varieties and with far greater confidence in its purity, that ritual of a warm, comforting brew still whispers of its historical significance. Your morning latte or even your herbal infusion owes a surprising debt to those early, often unpalatable, Victorian brews. Think, too, about the very concept of breakfast as a distinct, important meal. While people have always eaten in the morning, the Victorian era, particularly among the middle and upper classes, truly solidified breakfast as a formal, multi-course affair. This idea of a substantial first meal that sets the tone for the day. A full English, American pancakes, or a continental spread, can trace its roots back to the increasingly elaborate morning rituals of the 19th century. We may not have servants to lay out a dozen dishes, but the expectation of a hearty start remains. Beyond the food itself, the lessons of food safety, born from the horrors of adulteration, are perhaps the most profound legacy. The very fact that you can confidently buy milk, bread, or sugar today without fear of chalk dust, lead chromate, or plaster of Paris is a direct result of the public outcry and subsequent legislation championed. In the late Victorian period, the foundations of modern food standards, quality control, and consumer protection were laid in response to the very dangers we explored. Ensuring that your breakfast is not a daily gamble. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this legacy is the establishment of consumer protection movements and regulatory bodies. The Victorian era saw the first significant legislative efforts to combat food fraud and ensure public health, ultimately leading to the formation of government agencies dedicated to food safety. Without the grim lessons learned from adulterated breakfasts, our modern food systems would likely be far less secure. It's a testament to how past struggles shape present conveniences, allowing you to enjoy your avocado toast without fear of hidden toxins. Now for a quirky tidbit. The Victorian emphasis on digestive biscuits and specific breakfast cereals like shredded wheat, invented in the late Victorian period, was often driven by moralistic and pseudoscientific beliefs about digestion and temperance, not just nutrition. The idea was that bland, fibrous foods would promote both physical and moral purity, preventing overindulgence and other perceived vices. So, your ancestors might have been munching on their fiber not just for health, but for their immortal souls. It gives a whole new meaning to breakfast of champions, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the lasting impact of Victorian food production and consumption patterns on modern industrial food systems has been predominantly positive, leading to greater access and affordability, or predominantly negative, contributing to issues like ultra-processed foods and a disconnection from traditional culinary practices. Did the pursuit of efficiency truly serve us best in the long run? You consider your own breakfast this morning, perhaps a quick granola bar, or a smoothie, and realize the surprising echoes of those Victorian mornings. The quiet, comforting hum of the refrigerator, the simple act of choosing from a vast selection, the absolute certainty of safety, these are luxuries earned through the silent struggles of children long past, a subtle, profound legacy that continues to nourish us in more ways than one. And as the last echoes of the past gently recede, it's time for your own world to quiet down. Let the images of smoky kitchens and grand dining rooms soften at the edges, blurring into the peaceful calm of your own surroundings. Feel the stillness settle around you, a gentle blanket woven from forgotten facts and whispered histories. Allow any lingering thoughts to drift away, like motes of dust dancing in a forgotten sunbeam. The day's demands are far off now, nothing but a faint whisper on the wind. Your mind is quiet, your body is at ease. Just breathe, slowly and deeply. Let the soft hum of ambient sounds, or the gentle silence of your room, guide you deeper into relaxation. The stories of yesterday have been told, and now, all that remains is the sweet promise of peaceful rest. Let sleep, soft and kind, embrace you.